In the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic, in the early hours of April 15, 1912, the world's most famous ship slipped beneath the surface and into history. The Titanic, a vessel that had been called unsinkable, became one of the greatest tragedies of the modern age, and one of the most powerful legends ever told. More than a century later, the story of the Titanic continues to fascinate, not only because of the horror of that night, but because of the myths, mysteries, and unanswered questions that still surround it. What really happened on that fateful voyage? How much of what we know is true, and how much has been shaped by time, imagination, and human need for meaning? When the Titanic set sail from Southampton, England, on April 10, 1912, it was a symbol of human achievement. Built by the White Star Line, the ship was the largest and most luxurious ocean liner ever constructed. It stretched almost 270 meters long, weighed over 46,000 tons, and could carry more than 2,200 passengers and crew. Inside, it was a floating palace. Marble staircases, chandeliers, Turkish baths, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. For the rich and powerful, it represented progress, modernity, and the belief that human engineering could conquer nature itself. Yet, from the very beginning, the Titanic's story was shadowed by irony and hubris. Journalists and advertisers claimed it was practically unsinkable, though this phrase never appeared in official documents. The ship had been designed with advanced safety features, 16 watertight compartments meant to keep it afloat even if 4 of them were flooded. But no one imagined a disaster large enough to breach more than that. The belief in its invincibility created a dangerous sense of complacency. The Titanic's maiden voyage attracted some of the wealthiest people in the world. American millionaires like John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, as well as hundreds of emigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, traveling in steerage in search of a new life in America. They all shared the same sea, but not the same fate. When the ship struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, it took only 2 hours and 40 minutes for the unthinkable to happen. Survivors later recalled a night filled with confusion, disbelief, and chaos. The impact was gentle, almost unnoticed by many passengers, but the damage below the waterline was catastrophic. 6 compartments were torn open by the iceberg's jagged edge. As the forward sections filled with icy water, the ship began to list. Officers gave the order to uncover the lifeboats, but there were only enough for about half of those on board. Regulations at the time required lifeboats for just a fraction of passengers, based on a ship's tonnage rather than its capacity. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, capable of holding around 1,200 people. More than 2,200 were aboard. As the reality of the disaster set in, acts of heroism and selfishness unfolded side by side. Some men dressed as women to secure a place in lifeboats, while others stood back, accepting their fate. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, famously continued to play music until the very end, a haunting symbol of calm amid catastrophe. Captain Edward Smith, who had commanded some of White Star's greatest ships, went down with his vessel. Benjamin Guggenheim put on his finest evening wear and said to a steward, "Tell my wife I've behaved like a gentleman." At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's lights flickered once and went out forever. The massive ship split apart, the bow plunging into the depths, followed minutes later by the stern. Over 2,500 people perished in the freezing waters. The rescue ship Carpathia arrived nearly 2 hours later, pulling 705 survivors from lifeboats. The rest vanished into the endless sea. News of the disaster spread across the world within hours. The Titanic had been a symbol of human triumph. Now it was a symbol of tragedy. But almost immediately, myths and conspiracies began to grow. Some claimed the ship had been cursed from the start, pointing to eerie coincidences, like an 1898 novel called Futility, written by Morgan Robertson, which told of an unsinkable ship named Titan that struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank with massive loss of life. The similarities were uncanny. Others believed the White Star Line tried to cover up design flaws or crew negligence. Perhaps the most persistent myth is that the Titanic was swapped with her nearly identical sister ship, the Olympic, as part of an insurance fraud scheme. The Olympic had been damaged in a collision the year before, and conspiracy theorists argue that White Star Line intentionally sent the Titanic, or rather the damaged Olympic disguised as the Titanic, to sea, planning to sink her and claim the insurance money. Yet despite decades of speculation, no solid evidence has ever supported this theory. The Shipwreck, discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard, clearly showed Titanic's serial number and distinctive design features. The truth was simpler and more tragic: overconfidence, miscommunication, and human error. For years after the disaster, survivors struggled to move on. Some became lifelong advocates for maritime safety, leading to major reforms. The tragedy prompted the creation of the International Ice Patrol and new laws requiring enough lifeboats for every passenger. But others lived with guilt and nightmares. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking survivor, rarely spoke of that night, haunted by the cries of the dying. Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, used her fame to raise funds for survivors and their families. The Titanic story soon entered legend. It became a moral parable, a tale of human pride punished by nature. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians turned it into myth. By the mid-20th century, the Titanic was no longer just a shipwreck. It was a symbol of the fallibility of modern progress. Each generation reimagined the story in its own way, from Walter Lord's 1955 book A Night to Remember to James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, which transformed the tragedy into an epic of love, loss, and human endurance. Yet despite the fame, there are still mysteries. Why did the crew ignore iceberg warnings from nearby ships? Could the disaster have been prevented if the Californian, just miles away, had responded to Titanic's distress rockets? Were some bodies never recovered because of cover-ups or misreporting? Every theory adds another layer to the myth. Over a century later, the Titanic still lies 2.5 miles beneath the ocean's surface, preserved in cold darkness. Explorers who have visited describe a haunting scene. The bow still recognizable, staircases leading to nowhere, shoes scattered on the seabed where people once stood. It is both a grave and a monument, a reminder of human ambition and vulnerability. So, was the sinking of the Titanic myth or reality? The event itself was painfully real. More than 1,500 souls lost to the Atlantic. But the way it lives in our imagination is mythic. The Titanic has become a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal struggle with arrogance, fate, and the limits of technology. It teaches us that even the mightiest creations can fall, that progress without humility can lead to ruin, and that behind every grand story lies countless personal tragedies. The Titanic may have sunk in 1912, but its story will never drown. It continues to rise again and again in our collective memory, not just as a tale of disaster, but as a timeless reminder of how fragile and precious life truly is.